My next door neighbor has a garden. I've been watching these two birds fight each other for the past week or so. One will land in the tree and the other one will chase after it, tittering, and chase it off to another branch where it'll follow and chase it. I've seen them really fighting, kicking up some dirt, making a lot of noise. I've heard that in nature, when an animal escapes death or encounters another traumatic situation, after the incident, it will shake, as if shaking off the experience, processing it, and move on with its life. But animals in captivity, that is, domesticated animals like humans, we don't do this. And it's a little different. Once you're domesticated, once you're living in one place, then every day you see the same places where the trauma happened. You're living in the same institutions wherever you go that allowed the trauma to happen. A human life is very long. In a bird's life, you might be born as the bird who gets picked on, or you might be the bird who bullies. In a human life, you might be the bully in your childhood, and then you'll be the one who's picked on later in life. And then you get older and you're just lost. Or maybe a different combination. The north node, south node nodes of the moon are often translated and interpreted as your past life for the south node and your destiny or where you're headed in this life for your north node. And through working with Saturn for the past, I think it's been 5 years, and studying Saturn return and researching, collecting data. What does this mean? What will this have in store for me? I think I come to see that your south node, or one where the south node of the moon is at your birth, doesn't necessarily relate or inform of a past life that was your past life before your birth. I think in a way it does. Your south node placement might inform you about what you had to do in your past life to survive or to get what you wanted, or even what your former destiny was. And so when soul carries over into this life, it's operating under the rules of this realm, particular to this family and place and time in history. And it's also operating under what it's carried over from its past life. You could call it karma, which is not to say the good or the bad that you've done, but the conditioning of your soul. So you have the karma of this life, which is what you were born into, the body, the family, the place, the time, and the karma kind of carried over. I think that's the South Node. And I read somewhere, I'm forgetting where now, but I can find it, that Plato suggested that one's soul does not really arrive or is born until you're 28, which is kind of on the precipice of Saturn return. I think there are many lives within a human life. I think that we can use planets and constellations to mark time passing. What was life like the last time Saturn was here? What was life like the last time anything was anywhere? What was it like? What's changed? These cycles and kind of rhythms of life allows us to be self-reflective and to look at our past selves without attachment or ego, to say, this is where I was and there's nothing more to it. No, this is where I was and that's why this, or I was here because excuse. What if that's just where you were? What if you're just where you are now and it has nothing to do with destiny? It has nothing to do with planetary movements. Actually, it has everything to do with your own life and what you're doing with it. Stars, planets, asteroids, math of this all, it doesn't tell you who you are. Astrology is not fatalistic. I hope that's the right use of the word. It doesn't tell you what's going to happen. It cycles back on itself. And our lives are reflected in that. So I think if we pay attention to ourselves, we can begin to know what to expect. Not literally, because I don't think most things use a language of specificity. When you're looking into the future, if you were to say, this will happen with certainty, chances are, I think it won't. But usually, maybe a greater chance is that it will and it won't. In August of 2017, almost 11 in the morning, I sat on a couch with my friend Aaron, and I was telling him about how I had been studying astrology at this point for maybe 8 or 9 years. And maybe 8 years. And I told him I started to become interested in the actual travel time of some of these slower planets, of the lifetime planets of Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto. How long does it take for them to go around? I said, I feel like I don't really know these that well because they're so on the outskirts. So their reign is very broad. They're not this day-to-day sort of human understanding of time that's very quick and changing and self-centered. They're broader and slower. They're like the plates that move under the earth. What is that? So he started looking up how long it takes for each of these planets to make a full cycle around the sun. And so he started looking at Pluto. I very much enjoy Pluto. And it told him about a theory that Isabel Hickey had first written about in maybe the 90s, wherein when Pluto is in 2 degrees of a sign to stay, historically world wars have happened at this time. So I looked up when the next one was going to be. I still have that screenshot from that day of the chart. And it's expected in April of 2024. That's what the data says, anyway, you know? It could be later. Maybe it's earlier. I could probably refine the data. It was a quick trial and error. And then we started thinking, well, how old are things we know in terms of planetary cycles? Pluto has a long cycle. So we looked up where Pluto was at the birth of the United States on July 4th, 1776. I hope that's right. And we looked to see where it might end up. I was in this study of Saturn return, and I thought, what is a Pluto return? And Aaron and I did some math, and Pluto on that day, let's see if I have it. Pluto is expected to return to the same place, exact degree it was at the time the United States was born, in February of 2022. Here we are in 2020 at the precipice of Pluto return for the United States, and World War 2 years later. What will this look like at this time? For a few years I've been thinking this year will be very important because it's an election year that will elect whoever will face 2022 and 2024. And the way things are going, I imagined that one possibility could be moving into a type of third-dom, into not Democrat or Republican, but something else. What is it? It's sort of moving away from duality. But do we move away from duality into myriad things or into one? In other words, we're kind of at the precipice of dictatorship and socialism in one sense. I thought this by a lot of other dualistic things breaking down culturally, socially. I wondered if that concept will ripple in other realms, meaning in the social realm, the political realm, etc. read what Isabel Hickey wrote. She wrote it in A Cosmic Science. This book was first written in the 70s, and I quite like it. Actually, it's the only book that I'll read about astrology. It might be because it's the first one that I really read. It might be because she seems to write each section toward who she's writing about or what she's writing about. And there's this way of embodying the concept in words, and I appreciate that. She also breaks things down. I like looking towards the most primary of sources. There's a lot of information that goes around that's interpretation of interpretation of interpretation. You don't need a book, let alone the internet, to tell you about astrology. You just need to look at the stars and see what happens, and reflect, and keep track. And the next time that happens, say, what was similar about this time and that time? What were the variables? There was this common theme of this, but there were some subtle differences that might have to do with other forces at work. It's actually, you can be rather scientific about it, even if we don't think of astrology as science. You can still perform experiments. Let's see. This book is from 1992, this version, and that's important because she rewrote it with a section on Pluto. And that was pretty big. I don't know who else was writing about Pluto astrologically in history or in the 90s, but I very much appreciate that section. I'm a fan of Pluto. Have you heard the sound of Pluto? The NASA recordings of the sounds of each planet. Pluto just sounds like a dream. I want to read from Isabel Hickey's book. This is in chapter 38, The Perversions of Plutonian Power. In June 1914, Pluto entered Cancer to stay. 1 month later, when Pluto was in 2 degrees of Cancer, World War I began. The U.S. entered the war in April 1917, when Pluto was again in 2 degrees of Cancer. In July 1939, Pluto entered Leo to stay. At the end of 1 month, Pluto was in 2 degrees of Leo. England declared war on Germany and World War II began. In 1957, Pluto was in 2 degrees of Virgo, and the Southeast Asian War was on. In 1972, Pluto entered Libra, and with Pluto in 2 degrees of Libra, the undeclared World War III, people nowadays won't remember this, but that was the Vietnam War. This is in quotes, World War III, was supposed to have stopped, but the American bombing continued. At the time of this writing, June 1973, I guess she wrote this in the 70s. With Pluto in 2 degrees of Libra, it does not look as though war is ended, regardless of what the government tells us. Violence is often associated with Pluto. It can be representative of organized evil as well as organized good. Organization is one of the key words applicable to Pluto. It is a strange force. It can activate a group to be far more vicious than any one person would be by himself. The Mafia, Hitler's stormtroopers, Charles Manson's followers, and the Hells Angels are all manifestations of Pluto. Feeling no attunement to the forces of light and their own true identity, they find a sense of belongingness in a group that gives them a sense of importance. They feel they are a part of a group that has authority and thus can frighten others into submission. As part of a group, they do things that they would never do on their own. Singly, they are cowards. In mob psychology, the mob acts at a far lower level of consciousness than any one person would act by himself. As far as mass consciousness is concerned, the use of this energy is destructive rather than constructive. The atom bomb is the destructive use of Plutonian energy. Pluto has a special rulership over groups. People with an angular or prominent Pluto have the ability to work with groups. Any planet is prominent if it is in an angular house, or configurated strongly with the Sun, Moon, or Mercury. When the destructive side of Pluto is dominant, then the resourcefulness and power inherent in this energy is turned against society. The individual begins to prey on society. If powerful enough, he becomes the ruthless dictator. Outside the law, he operates through mobs. Inside the law, Pluto operates through committees and groups dedicated to upholding the law. Pluto always operates as a dichotomy, one group polarizing or opposing another group. Next to group activity, the conflict of opposing interests is most indicative of Plutonian energies. A prominent Pluto in a birth chart gives a great sensitivity to the inner planes. These individuals can take the highway or the low way, contacting the forces of light or the forces of evil. Note Charles Manson's chart in the last chapter of this book. The invasion of the wrong forces is clearly shown. It is easy for individuals with a prominent Pluto to develop extrasensory perception and contact the inner planes for good or evil. The word is ill, for good or ill. Pluto operates undercover, and even astronomically operates eccentrically. It remains out of bounds where the zodiacal limit is concerned. Its orbit is different from the other planets. It moves through some signs in 13 years, but takes 32 to traverse other signs. The average time in a sign is about 26 years. Here is Isabel Hickey's opinion, or theory. Only as individuals can we change and grow in consciousness, and lift the planet to a higher level of beingness. Then the higher side of Pluto, which we call Minerva, or wisdom, begins to operate. The forces of light and the world servers are connected with the higher aspect of Pluto. The dark forces use the Pluto force destructively, and thereby bring on their own destruction. Organized evil is beyond the comprehension of the average person. The forces of light and their work is just as little understood. Always and always we can choose which is right for us. I made a chart looking at all of the planetary movements in 2020, preparing for my Saturn return, which began in April 2020 and will return again in December due to its retrograde. I wanted to see what else was happening in the sky at this time. This was a couple of years ago, at least 2019, but it was either on I drew these on New Year's Day. It may have been 2019, it could have been 2018. Regardless, it was a couple years ago. So I looked for the data. And, what planets will be in which signs, who will retrograde. And almost every planet retrogrades this year. Beginning with Pluto in April, and shortly thereafter, Saturn in May, then Venus, then Jupiter, Mercury. Venus goes direct, then Neptune, then Chiron, Mercury goes direct, then Uranus, then Mars. What a year this is. Here's the data that I collected. On this side, this is time going down. And the chart shows you in which location and at which degree this is happening. I started off by talking about the birds. Through my studies of Saturn return, I had the hope that by the time Saturn would return, I will have realized how much I have grown and how much more capacity I have for life. But actually, when I look at the data, when Saturn returns, it's like we drown again in all of our habits and attachments and who we wish we were and who we've been in the past. We don't just get a free pass, ever. I think about the birds and how sometimes you're born as the one who is the bully, and somehow you're born as the one who's picked on. And there might not be enough time in bird life to change that. There might be something that gets carried on into the next life. Whatever translation of that you may take for your own. We're coming upon this great change, Plutonian change for the United States. And when it happens, it won't be a culmination of all we have done. It will just be what we're doing in that moment. Maybe we'll have the opportunity to not be a bully anymore. Maybe we'll have the opportunity to be a dictatorship, or to form small communities as if states became their own countries. Perhaps with everything going retrograde this year, not everything, but many, we have this opportunity to reflect. When something goes retrograde, it doesn't make things broken. Things were already broken. When Mercury retrogrades and suddenly your laptop is dying, it's not dying because Mercury went retrograde. Just as you acting a certain way isn't because of your moon placement. You're acting that way because you're acting that way. The planets don't get to be your excuse. And Mercury didn't break your laptop. You didn't take care of it. And now it's catching up. With so much opportunity for reflection this year, where have we been when all of these planets were in the past? Saturn will return to X degree of Y sign, as will Mars and Neptune and Uranus and Pluto and Venus this year. When was the last time they were there? What was going on in our lives? Who did we wish we could become in those moments? Can we do that now? Can we do something different? Otherwise, I think Saturn will continue to return, as will the sun every year. And we'll be the people we've always been. And this will be the country it's always been.